Hello and welcome. Perhaps you're lying in bed right now, or maybe you've simply carved out a quiet moment in the noise of the day. Either way, this is a calm space for us to drift together through questions that have no easy answers. Questions about memory, reality, and the strange places where those two meet. Let me ask you something gentle. Do you remember the Berenstain Bears? Those cheerful cartoon bears from childhood, with their cozy treehouse and gentle life lessons? If you grew up reading those books, you probably have a memory of the name. Close your eyes for just a moment and picture the cover. What do you see written there? Many people, perhaps even you, would swear the name was spelled Berenstein, Berenstain Bears. It feels right, doesn't it? The Stein ending, common in so many names, natural, familiar, certain, and yet every book ever printed, every official record, every piece of physical evidence shows something else entirely. Berenstain, with an A. It's always been that way. The publishers confirm it. The creator's family confirms it. The evidence is unanimous and unwavering. But here's what makes this more than a simple mistake. Thousands upon thousands of people remember it the other way. Not just a vague sense of uncertainty, but vivid, detailed, confident memory. The same wrong memory, shared across continents, across generations, across people who've never met. This is called the Mandela Effect. And it's far stranger than a simple error of recall. Because memory, as neuroscience has shown us, is not photographic. We don't record experience like a camera and play it back unchanged. Memory is reconstructive. Each time we remember something, we're rebuilding it from fragments, filling gaps, smoothing edges, creating something that feels whole, even when pieces are missing or altered. Our brains are storytellers, not archivists, but that raises an unsettling question. If our memories are constructions, unreliable and changeable, then what happens when thousands of separate minds construct the same false memory? What happens when strangers scattered across the world remember the same thing that never was? This is where we begin our journey tonight. Not with answers, we'll find precious few of those, but with wonder, with curiosity about the gap between what we remember and what is, with gentle speculation about why that gap exists at all, and what it might mean about the nature of memory, reality, and the strange borderlands between them. Take a breath, let your shoulders soften. We have time. The name for this phenomenon came from a woman named Fiona Broom, though the experience she described has echoed through countless minds. In 2010 at a conference, she was making small talk about Nelson Mandela, the South African anti-apartheid revolutionary, the man who became president, the global symbol of reconciliation and resistance. And in that conversation, she mentioned something she remembered clearly: his death in prison in the 1980s. She remembered news coverage. She remembered the funeral. She remembered the widow's grief and the global mourning. The person she was speaking with paused. They remembered the same thing, the same impossible thing. Because Nelson Mandela didn't die in prison in the 1980s. He was released in 1990 after 27 years of incarceration. He lived to become South Africa's president. He lived until 2013, passing away at age 95, decades after the death Fiona Broom and others vividly remembered. This wasn't uncertainty. This wasn't the typical fuzziness of distant events. These were detailed confidence, specific memories of something that never happened. And as Broom began discussing this publicly, she discovered she wasn't alone. Hundreds, then thousands of people came forward with identical false memories. They remembered the funeral. They remembered the widow. They remembered the specific weight of that historical moment, a moment that never occurred. Psychology has terms for this: confabulation, the production of fabricated or distorted memories without conscious intention to deceive; source monitoring errors, the confusion about where a memory came from; mixing imagination with experience, dreams with waking life; things heard about with things witnessed. Our minds are remarkably creative, constantly weaving narratives from fragments, and sometimes those narratives feel more real than reality itself. But here's what keeps pulling us back to this mystery: the specificity and consistency. If these were random errors, we'd expect random content. Different people would remember different false deaths, different impossible events, scattered across the landscape of human history. Instead, we find clusters, patterns, groups of strangers with identical errors, down to surprising details. Some have suggested simple explanations. Perhaps there was news coverage of Mandela's imprisonment that felt conclusive, that our minds interpreted as death. Perhaps we conflated him with other figures, other deaths, other historical moments. Perhaps media, repeated over time, planted seeds that grew into false certainty, and perhaps that's true. Perhaps that's the whole answer. That there's something haunting about standing in that space where your memory insists on one reality, and all evidence points to another. It touches something deeper than factual error. It raises questions about the reliability of subjective experience itself, about whether the felt truth of a memory has any relationship to its actual truth. We remember, therefore we know, or so we believe. But what if we remember things that never were? What then? Once you start looking, these collective false memories appear everywhere, like stars emerging as your eyes adjust to darkness. They're not rare anomalies, they're surprisingly common, and they follow patterns that feel almost deliberate, as if reality itself is playing a subtle, repetitive game. Consider the Monopoly man, that cheerful capitalist icon from the board game. Picture him now: top hat, mustache, cane, tails, and a monocle, right? That little round eyeglass, marking him as a proper aristocrat. Except he's never had one, not in any official version, not in any edition across the game's long history. The monocle is a phantom, a detail thousands remember with absolute confidence that simply doesn't exist. Or take Curious George, the mischievous little monkey from children's books. Many people remember him having a tail, because of course monkeys have tails, don't they? Except Curious George never had one. He's been tail-free since his first appearance in 1941, drawn consistently by his creators as a small ape, not a monkey. But the memory of that tail persists, vivid and certain in minds around the world. Then there's perhaps the most famous cinematic misquote: "Luke, I am your father." Ask someone to quote the big reveal from The Empire Strikes Back, and that's what many will say. It's become cultural shorthand, repeated in parodies and references for decades. Except Darth Vader never says those words. The actual line is, "No, I am your father," 4 syllables different. But the false version has taken root so deeply that even people who've watched the scene dozens of times often remember it incorrectly. Schema theory offers an elegant explanation. Our brains operate on patterns, on expectations, on templates built from experience. We expect wealthy characters to have monocles because we've seen that visual shorthand so often. We expect monkeys to have tails because most do. We expect dramatic reveals to be self-contained and quotable. So our minds helpfully edit the line to make it so. Memory, in this view, is driven more by what should be than what actually was. And that makes sense. It's reasonable. It explains the mechanism behind individual errors. But it doesn't quite capture the uncanny feeling of discovering that thousands of other people made the exact same predictable error you did. The same wrong monocle, the same phantom tail, the same edited quotation. Patterns in human cognition are one thing, but patterns this consistent, this specific, this synchronized across millions of separate minds, that begins to feel like something else. Not necessarily proof of anything extraordinary, but an invitation to wonder, an invitation to notice the strangeness beneath the explanation, the mystery that persists even after the science has spoken. Something about these shared errors feels designed, feels intentional. Feels like a message if only we knew how to read it. So we're left standing at an interesting threshold. On one side, psychology, neuroscience, perfectly reasonable explanations for why memory fails in predictable ways. Our brains take shortcuts. We fill gaps with expectations. We're influenced by media, by each other, by the stories culture tells. Memory is fragile, suggestible, easily bent. There's no deep mystery here, just the ordinary workings of an imperfect biological system doing its best. And yet, there's a pull towards something else, isn't there? A sense that the pattern means something beyond mere cognitive error. That same intuition that makes us see faces in clouds and constellations in stars. That ancient pattern-seeking drive that kept our ancestors alive whispers that perhaps there's more here than meets the eye. This is where some minds have wandered toward a rather extraordinary possibility. If our memories, thousands of them, millions of them, diverge from recorded reality in systematic, consistent ways, what does that imply about the nature of reality itself? Could these false memories be glitches, not in our brains, but in the fabric of existence? It sounds wild, I know. It sounds like the premise of science fiction, the territory of conspiracy thinking, and late-night speculation. And perhaps it is. Perhaps this is just our meaning-making machinery running overdrive, finding patterns that aren't truly there, building narratives from coincidence and confusion. But let's sit with the question for a moment anyway, not because we're committing to an answer, but because the question itself reveals something interesting about human consciousness, about our relationship to certainty, to evidence, to the felt truth of our own experience. We trust our memories. We have to. They form the foundation of identity, the through line of selfhood across time. I am the person who remembers, we might say. But if those memories are unreliable, if we can vividly, confidently remember things that never happened, then what does that do to our sense of who we are? What does it do to our trust in our own minds? Perhaps this is why the Mandela Effect has captured so many imaginations. It's not really about the Berenstain Bears or movie quotations. It's about something more fundamental, the unsettling discovery that we cannot fully trust the primary tool we use to navigate existence. Our memories, our direct subjective experiences, might be lies we tell ourselves without knowing we're lying. And if that's true, if we're unreliable narrators of our own lives, then maybe, just maybe, the gap between memory and reality is worth exploring. Not with certainty, but with curiosity. Not with conclusions, but with wonder. Maybe we're drawn to this mystery because it touches something fundamental about the nature of consciousness itself, about the strange fact of being aware, of experiencing, of remembering, and the profound uncertainty hiding beneath all of it. Let that thought settle. We'll return to it soon. Before we drift too far into speculation, let's ground ourselves in something solid, the science of memory itself. Not because science has all the answers, it doesn't, but because understanding the mechanism makes the mystery richer, not shallower. Like learning how a magic trick works and finding it more beautiful, not less. Your brain is not a recording device. This is the first thing to know, the foundational truth that makes everything else make sense. When you experience something, this moment, right now, the sound of these words, the feeling of wherever you are, your brain doesn't capture it like a camera and file it away intact. Instead, it breaks experience into components. Visual information processed in one region, emotional valence in another, spatial context in another, semantic meaning in yet another. These pieces are encoded separately, scattered across neural networks like fragments of a shattered mirror. Then comes consolidation. In the hours and days after an experience, particularly during sleep, that mysterious state will all be approaching soon. Your brain gradually stabilizes these fragments. The hippocampus, a seahorse-shaped structure deep in your temporal lobe, acts as a conductor, coordinating the conversation between different brain regions. helping them agree on what happened and where to store it for the long term. It's an active, effortful process, not passive storage. The brain is choosing what to keep and what to discard, what to strengthen and what to let fade. But here's where it gets truly interesting: retrieval. When you remember something, you're not playing back a recording, you're reconstructing the experience from those scattered fragments. The brain pulls pieces from different storage sites, assembles them into something coherent, and presents that construction to consciousness as memory. And each time you do this, each time you remember, you slightly alter the memory itself. Remembering changes the thing remembered. This is called reconsolidation, and it means that memories are not fixed artifacts. They're living, evolving, constantly rewritten stories we tell ourselves about the past. Elizabeth Loftus spent decades demonstrating just how malleable these stories are. In famous experiments, she showed that you can implant entirely false memories of being lost in a shopping mall as a child, of witnessing crimes that never occurred, simply through suggestion and repeated questioning. The memories feel real. People will describe details, emotions, sensory experiences of events that never happened, not because they're lying, but because memory doesn't distinguish between experienced reality and vividly imagined fiction once the construction is complete. We are unreliable narrators of our own lives. Not sometimes, always. Every memory you hold is a story your brain has told itself, edited and revised with each retelling. And that story feels true, feels certain, feels solid, even when it's built on fragments, guesses, and reconstructed fiction. So perhaps the Mandela Effect isn't revealing a glitch in reality. Perhaps it's revealing the truth about memory itself, that we're all constantly remembering things that never quite were, filling our minds with beautiful, coherent, utterly unreliable stories about a past that exists now only as neural pattern, as electrochemical echo, as narrative dream. But if memory is individually unreliable, how do we explain collective errors? If each of us is reconstructing the past from our own scattered fragments, why do thousands of separate minds reconstruct the same false details? This is where memory stops being just a personal phenomenon and becomes something social, something shared and shaped by the communities we inhabit. Memory spreads like a story told around a fire, changing slightly with each retelling but maintaining certain core features that stick. Psychologists call this the misinformation effect, when information encountered after an event gets incorporated into memory of the event itself. Someone tells you they saw a stop sign at an intersection where you witnessed an accident, and later you might remember that stop sign too, even if what was actually there was a yield sign. The new information doesn't feel like an addition. It feels like it was always there, always part of your original memory. Now scale this up. Take a cultural touchstone like the Berenstain Bears, experienced by millions of children across decades. Imagine a child reading the name, pronouncing it in their head as Berenstain, because that's a familiar pattern, a common name structure they've encountered before. They never hear it spoken correctly. They simply internalize their own phonetic guess. Years pass. They encounter others who made the same guess. In online forums, in casual conversation, they see Berenstain written again and again by other people. Each exposure strengthens the false memory. Social reinforcement makes it feel more real, more certain, more solidly true. This is not a conspiracy. It's not coordination. It's emergent, a pattern that arises from thousands of individual errors that happen to align because we all share similar cognitive architecture, similar cultural contexts, similar exposure to the same stimuli. We fill gaps in the same predictable ways because we're working with similar biological tools, shaped by similar evolutionary pressures, immersed in similar media environments. Consider how memes spread, how phrases catch fire, how certain images or ideas achieve ubiquity, seemingly overnight. The mechanisms are the same. Repetition, social proof, the human instinct to align with the group, to trust what others claim to know. If 10 people tell you they remember something a certain way, your brain begins to doubt its own different memory. It's adaptive, in a sense. The crowd is often right. Trusting collective memory over individual recall usually makes sense. But sometimes the crowd is collectively wrong. Sometimes social reinforcement amplifies error instead of correcting it. The Mandela Effect might be what happens when false memory achieves critical mass. When enough people share the same error that it starts to feel more authoritative than actual evidence. There's something both troubling and beautiful about this. Troubling because it shows how easily we can be led astray, how our memories are shaped not just by experience, but by community, by conversation, by the stories we tell each other. Beautiful because it reveals how interconnected we are, how our minds are not isolated islands, but nodes in a vast social network, constantly influencing and being influenced by every other mind we encounter. We remember together. We misremember together too, and perhaps that shared misremembering says something profound about the nature of human consciousness itself. That we don't just think in private, behind closed doors, we think in chorus. Let's shift perspective now, from memory to perception itself. Because there's a deeper layer here, a more fundamental strangeness about how consciousness works, that might help illuminate why memory fails in the particular ways it does. Your brain is not a passive receiver of reality. This might be the most important thing neuroscience has discovered about perception in the last few decades. We tend to think we simply open our eyes and the world pours in, that we hear sounds as they occur, feel textures as they exist. But that's not quite how it works. Instead, your brain is constantly generating predictions about what it expects to perceive, and then checking those predictions against incoming sensory data. Perception is less like observation and more like controlled hallucination. Your brain's best guess about what's out there, continually updated by sensory evidence but never purely driven by it. This is called predictive processing, sometimes framed in mathematical terms as a Bayesian brain, a system that combines prior expectations with new evidence to generate probabilistic models of reality. When you walk into a familiar room, your brain predicts what you'll see before you fully process the visual information. Most of the time, prediction matches reality closely enough that you don't notice the gap. But when there's a mismatch, something unexpected in a familiar context, you get that little jolt of surprise, that moment of confusion, as your brain updates its model. This is efficient. It has to be. Raw sensory data is overwhelming, a blooming, buzzing confusion of signals. If your brain had to process every photon, every sound wave, every tactile sensation from scratch without any organizing framework, consciousness would be impossible. Prediction allows you to navigate a complex world quickly, to react to threats before fully analyzing them, to function smoothly in environments you've encountered before. But it also means you don't see reality directly. You see your brain's prediction of reality, adjusted in real time by sensory input, but never purely determined by it. You see what you expect to see more than what's actually there. And when expectation is strong enough, when the prior is weighted heavily enough, you can miss what's right in front of you. Change blindness, inattentional blindness, the invisible gorilla walking through a basketball game that most observers never notice because they're not expecting it. Now apply this to memory. If perception is already predictive, already shaped by expectation, then memory, which is perception removed from the immediate constraint of sensory data, is even more predictive, even more shaped by what we expect to have experienced than by what actually occurred. When you remember the Monopoly Man, your brain might be constructing him from your schema of wealthy cartoon characters, and that schema includes a monocle because you've seen it so often in similar contexts. The prediction fills the gap where specific memory is weak, and the brain accepts the prediction as recall. This leads to a strange thought. Perhaps reality itself, as we experience it, is always partly fictional, always partly constructed from expectation, assumption, prior experience projected forward into the present moment. The line between perception and imagination is thinner than we'd like to believe. We're always partly dreaming, even when we're awake. And if that's true, then the Mandela Effect might not be a special case. It might be an everyday revelation showing us something true about consciousness itself, that we live not in reality directly, but in our mind's perpetual best guess about reality. A guess that's usually close enough, but never, ever perfect. Now we're going to take a gentle step into more speculative territory. Not because what follows is settled science. It's very much not. But because the question is beautiful, and because sometimes speculation opens doors that pure certainty keeps closed. There's a strange conversation happening at the edges of neuroscience and quantum physics. A conversation about whether the brain might involve quantum processes in ways that matter for consciousness. The hypothesis, most famously proposed by Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff, centers on tiny structures called microtubules, protein scaffolding inside neurons, cylindrical arrangements that help maintain cell structure and transport materials. These microtubules, Penrose and Hameroff suggest, might support quantum coherence, the delicate state where particles exist in superposition in multiple states simultaneously, before observation collapses them into definiteness. Most physicists are skeptical. Quantum effects are fragile, usually requiring extreme cold and isolation to persist. The brain is warm, wet, noisy, exactly the kind of environment where quantum coherence should collapse, almost instantly. And for most brain functions, classical neural computation seems entirely sufficient. We don't need quantum mechanics to explain how neurons fire or how networks process information. But consciousness is strange. It has qualities, subjective experience, unified perception, the hard problem of why there's something it's like to be you that seem difficult to explain with purely classical mechanisms. Some researchers wonder whether quantum processes might provide the missing piece, the source of awareness's peculiar properties, and memory too is strange in ways that invite quantum thinking. Think about how memories exist in a kind of superposition before recall. The past is quantum-like in its ambiguity, multiple possible versions coexisting in potential, until the act of remembering collapses one into actuality. You remember Bernstein or Bernstein, but not both. The act of recall forces a choice, crystallizes one version, makes it feel solid and certain, even when it might be constructed in that very moment. Could memory literally involve quantum processes? Could different versions of a memory exist in genuine superposition until retrieval collapses the possibility space into a single experienced memory? It's profoundly speculative. It stretches quantum mechanics into territory it wasn't designed for. It might be poetic metaphor rather than physical description, but the metaphor itself is illuminating. Even if memory is entirely classical, entirely explicable by conventional neuroscience, the quantum framing captures something true about the experience, that the past is not fixed, not definite, not singular, until we observe it through remembering. That act of remembering is creative, not merely reproductive. It collapses potentiality into actuality, possibility into specific experience. And if, this is a big if, a gentle what if rather than a claim. If quantum effects are somehow involved in consciousness, then the boundary between physical reality and mental experience becomes even stranger. Because in quantum mechanics, the observer matters, measurement changes the thing measured, consciousness might not be separate from the physical world, observing from outside, it might be entangled with reality at the deepest level, participating in the very construction of what is. This doesn't explain the Mandela Effect, but it reframes it. It suggests that maybe the line between memory and reality, between mind and world, is not as clear as we imagine. That maybe consciousness doesn't just reflect reality but participates in creating it, in choosing which version of the past becomes real through the act of remembering. Or maybe not. Maybe this is all just beautiful speculation, quantum poetry with no physical basis. Either way, it's worth wondering about as we drift deeper into the mystery. Let's wander further into speculation, into territory where science blurs into something stranger. Not because we're abandoning rigor, but because some ideas in physics are so peculiar that they make even the Mandela Effect seem almost reasonable by comparison. The many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, first proposed by Hugh Everett in 1957, suggests something extraordinary, that every quantum event that could have multiple outcomes actually has all those outcomes, each one real, each one occurring in a separate branch of reality. When a particle could go left or right, the universe splits, one version where it went left, another where it went right. Both are equally real. Both continue evolving, branching further with each subsequent quantum choice. The result is an unimaginably vast multiverse, a tree of forking paths, expanding at every quantum moment, containing every possibility that quantum mechanics allows. Most people hear this and assume it's science fiction, metaphor, speculative philosophy, but many physicists take it seriously as a literal description of reality. Not because there's direct evidence. How would you gather evidence of parallel universes you can't access? But because the mathematics of quantum mechanics seems to describe exactly this, and alternatives require adding extra assumptions to suppress the other branches. In a sense, many worlds is the simplest interpretation, the one that takes the equations at face value, without modification. Now, here's where it connects to our mystery. If every possibility becomes real somewhere, then there are universes nearly identical to ours, with only tiny differences. Universes where you had coffee instead of tea this morning. Universes where historical events unfolded slightly differently. Universes where, and this is where speculation becomes dizzying, the Berenstain Bears were spelled Berenstein. Could the Mandela Effect be memory bleed from adjacent timelines? Could we be remembering, in some strange way, events that did happen, but not in this branch of reality? Perhaps consciousness is not confined to a single universe. Perhaps memory can reach across the boundary between worlds, pulling fragments from neighboring branches where things were just slightly different. This sounds absurd, I know. There's no mechanism for it, no evidence supporting it, no reason to believe it beyond the fact that it would explain the strange pattern of collective false memories. But let's sit with it anyway, not as belief but as thought experiment. What would evidence of universe hopping even look like? It would probably look exactly like the Mandela Effect. Small, trivial details misremembered by large groups. Not major historical events. Those would be too conspicuous, too well documented, but minor things at the edges of attention. Spellings, brand names, movie lines. The kinds of details that might genuinely differ between nearly identical timelines, without causing major divergence in how history unfolds. And perhaps that's why these false memories feel so certain. They're not false in the usual sense. They're true memories from another branch of reality, bleeding through somehow, mixing with memories native to this timeline. The cognitive dissonance comes from trying to reconcile two sets of real memories from different versions of history. Or perhaps not. Perhaps this is just imagination running wild, quantum mechanics misapplied, desperate pattern seeking, trying to make sense of simple cognitive error. The multiverse interpretation itself remains controversial, and even if it's true, there's no reason to think consciousness can access parallel branches. But the speculation is worth having because it reveals something about the limits of knowledge. We don't know how consciousness works. We don't know if other universes exist. We don't know whether memory is purely neural or somehow extends beyond individual brains. These are open questions, genuinely mysterious, and the Mandela Effect sits right at the intersection of them all, a small mystery that points toward larger ones. Let's shift one more time, from physics to philosophy, from the nature of the universe to the nature of reality itself, because there's another way to think about all of this, one that doesn't require quantum mechanics or parallel universes, but that's equally strange in its own way. What makes something real? This might seem like an odd question with an obvious answer. Something is real if it exists independent of whether we believe in it or perceive it. The tree falls in the forest, whether or not anyone hears it. Reality is objective, solid, indifferent to human thought. But is that actually true? Not in some mystical sense, but in a practical, everyday sense. Consider money. Money is real. It buys food, shelter, determines who has power and who doesn't. Yet money only works because we collectively agree it works. The paper itself is worthless. The numbers in bank accounts are just data. Money is real because we treat it as real, because we have consensus about its value and function. It's a social construction, and yet it's as real as anything in human experience. Or consider nations. Borders don't exist in nature. There's no physical line dividing the United States from Canada, no inherent property of the land that makes one side American and the other Canadian. These categories are human inventions, collective agreements about how to organize territory and identity, and yet they're real in every meaningful sense. People die for nations. Wars are fought over borders. The construction has power precisely because we agree it does. Reality, in this view, is at least partly consensus, not the physical substrate. Atoms and forces presumably exist, whether we're here to perceive them or not. But the meaningful reality we inhabit, the world as experienced and navigated, is constructed through shared agreement about what things are, what they mean, how they function. Now apply this thinking to memory and history. What makes a historical fact true? Usually we'd say, because it happened, because there's evidence, because the past is fixed, and our job is merely to discover what occurred. But history, as we know it, is also a narrative, a story we tell ourselves about the past, and that story is constructed through consensus. Historians agree on certain frameworks, certain interpretations. Societies decide which events matter, which get commemorated, which get forgotten. The past itself is fixed, but history, our understanding of the past, is a collective construction, continually revised. False shared memories challenge this consensus. When thousands of people remember something that contradicts the historical record, it creates a kind of ontological crisis. Which is more real, the documented evidence, or the collective memory? If reality is partly consensus, and if a large enough group shares a false memory, does that memory acquire a kind of reality, even if it never physically occurred? This isn't to say all claims are equally valid or that evidence doesn't matter. The Berenstain Bears spelling is what it is, regardless of what anyone remembers, but there's a softer truth here too, that lived experience matters, that collective memory has power even when it's inaccurate, that the felt truth of remembering can be as significant as the factual truth of what happened. Perhaps the Mandela Effect reveals the tension between these two kinds of reality, the objective record and the collective subjective experience. And perhaps in that tension, in that gap between evidence and memory, we catch a glimpse of how strange reality really is. Not a simple given, not a fixed external thing, but something we participate in creating through perception, memory, agreement, and shared story. Take a breath. Let these ideas settle. Reality might be more negotiable than we've been taught to believe. We've been circling around an idea, approaching it from different angles, and now it's time to look at it directly. The simulation hypothesis, the notion that we might be living in a computer simulation created by some more advanced civilization. It sounds like science fiction, like the premise of a movie rather than serious philosophy. And yet there's an argument for it. A careful, logical, philosophically rigorous argument that's surprisingly difficult to dismiss. The philosopher Nick Bostrom published this argument in 2003, and it goes like this. Consider three possibilities. First, civilizations like ours, technologically capable, scientifically curious, almost always go extinct before reaching the ability to create sophisticated simulations of consciousness. Maybe we destroy ourselves through war, environmental collapse, or technologies we can't control. Second, civilizations that do survive choose not to create such simulations, perhaps for ethical reasons or simple lack of interest. Third, if civilizations regularly survive and do create simulations, then simulated realities vastly outnumber base reality, and statistically we're almost certainly in one. It's a trilemma. At least one of these propositions must be true, and here's the unsettling part. Unless you're confident that extinction is inevitable, or that future civilizations would definitely choose not to simulate, the third option becomes weirdly plausible. If ancestor simulations, recreations of historical periods run by post-human descendants studying their past, become technologically feasible and culturally acceptable, then there would be countless simulations for every one base reality. The ratio might be millions or billions to one, and if that's the case, the odds that you're in base reality rather than a simulation are vanishingly small. The argument doesn't prove we're simulated. It's a probabilistic claim based on assumptions about the future that we can't verify, but it shows that simulation isn't obviously absurd. Given certain reasonable assumptions about technology and civilization, being simulated becomes not just possible, but likely. The key concept here is computational substrate independence. The idea that consciousness doesn't require neurons specifically. If the mind is fundamentally a pattern of information processing, a particular kind of computation, then it should be possible to implement that computation on different physical substrates. Just as you can run the same software on different computers, perhaps consciousness could run on silicon chips, quantum computers, or technologies we haven't invented yet. If that's true, then creating conscious simulated beings becomes a matter of sufficient computing power and understanding of the algorithms involved. And here's where it gets personal, where it stops being abstract philosophy and becomes something that touches the nature of your own experience. If we are simulated, what would that mean? Would your consciousness be less real? Would your experiences, emotions, relationships matter less? Or would everything be exactly as it feels now, vivid, immediate, meaningful, with only the underlying substrate different from what you assumed? The simulation hypothesis doesn't require anything supernatural. It's entirely materialist, entirely compatible with physics as we understand it. It simply suggests that matter, or whatever actually exists, is arranged in a way you didn't expect, running a program that includes you, includes this moment, includes every thought you're having right now. The logic is tight, the conclusion is strange, and once you've encountered it, it's hard to completely dismiss, not as certainty, but as possibility, as one of the genuinely plausible answers to the question of what reality fundamentally is. But can consciousness really arise from computation? This is the deeper question, the one that determines whether simulation is even possible. Because if consciousness requires something beyond information processing, some special property of biological neurons, some mysterious quantum effect, some ineffable soul stuff, then simulating minds becomes impossible, no matter how much computing power you have. There are theories that suggest consciousness is indeed computational, that the subjective experience of awareness arises from certain kinds of information processing, regardless of the physical substrate doing the processing. Integrated information theory, developed by Giulio Tononi, proposes that consciousness corresponds to integrated information, roughly the degree to which a system's parts are interconnected in ways that make the whole more than the sum of its parts. A network with high integration generates more consciousness than one with low integration. In this view, consciousness is a measurable property of certain information structures, and anything, brain, computer, perhaps even more exotic systems, that instantiates such structures would be conscious to some degree. Global workspace theory, another prominent framework, suggests consciousness arises when information becomes globally available to multiple cognitive systems, when it's broadcast widely across a network rather than processed locally in isolated modules. Again, this is a functional definition. Consciousness depends on how information flows, not on what physical medium carries it. If you could create a computational system with the right architecture, the right patterns of information integration and broadcasting, it should, in principle, be conscious. These theories are controversial. The hard problem of consciousness, why there's something it's like to be a system, why subjective experience exists at all, remains unsolved. And many philosophers and scientists believe that functionalist theories like these miss something essential, that consciousness involves more than just computation, more than information processing alone can capture. But let's entertain the possibility that consciousness is substrate independent, that minds can be implemented in code. If that's true, then you are, in a sense, software, not metaphorically, but literally, a pattern of information processing running on the hardware of your brain. And if you're software, you're portable. You could, in principle, run on different hardware. You could be copied, modified, simulated. This leads to a strange thought. Perhaps consciousness is the universe's way of experiencing itself. Perhaps the cosmos, whether base reality or simulation, needed to organize matter into structures complex enough to generate awareness, to create inner worlds that mirror and wonder about the outer, from atoms to stars to brains to minds, an ascending ladder of complexity that eventually becomes aware of its own existence and asks why. And if we're simulated, if our consciousness is indeed computational and running in some vast computer, then maybe that's fine, maybe it doesn't matter. Because the experience is what we have, the felt quality of being, the texture of awareness, the mystery of existing at all. Whether that experience is generated by neurons or processors, whether it runs in base reality or layer upon layer of nested simulations, the consciousness itself is no less real for its substrate. You're here, you're aware, you're experiencing this moment. That fact doesn't change based on what physical medium is generating the experience. The substrate might matter for other questions about persistence, about the ethics of creation and deletion, but for the immediate truth of subjective experience, perhaps it doesn't matter at all. Perhaps consciousness is what matters, and everything else is just details about implementation. So let's play a thought experiment. If we are in a simulation, would there be ways to tell? Are there features of reality that seem suspiciously computational, that hint at an underlying architecture of code rather than fundamental physical law? Some have pointed to quantization, the fact that energy comes in discrete packets called quanta, rather than continuous flows. In quantum mechanics, there's a smallest possible unit of action, the Planck constant. Space and time themselves might be quantized at the Planck scale. Smallest possible length, smallest possible duration. This looks to some eyes like pixels, like the resolution limit of a computer simulation, beyond which nothing smaller exists, because nothing smaller was programmed. Then there's the speed of light, a universal speed limit built into the fabric of space-time. Nothing with mass can reach it. Information can't propagate faster than it. In a simulation, this would make sense. As a processing constraint, the simulation's update rate, the speed at which information can propagate through the computational substrate, would naturally impose a maximum speed within the simulation. Relativity, the strange fact that time dilates and space contracts for objects approaching light speed, might be artifacts of the simulation, rendering reality on the fly, saving processing power by updating fast-moving objects less frequently from their own perspective. And there's the mathematical structure of physics itself. The universe is shockingly describable in mathematical terms. Why should the cosmos follow elegant equations, obey symmetries and conservation laws, organize itself according to principles that our minds can grasp? And formalize one answer, because it's code. Because the laws of physics are literally algorithms, computational rules being executed to generate the appearance of continuous natural law. But here's the thing, all of these features have conventional explanations. Quantization arises naturally from wave mechanics, not because reality is pixelated, but because waves have intrinsic discrete properties. The speed of light is built into special relativity for geometric reasons, not computational ones. The mathematical structure of physics might reflect deep symmetries in nature, or it might reflect the fact that mathematics is the language we use to describe anything precise. We wouldn't even notice aspects of reality that don't fit mathematical frameworks. So these aren't proofs. They're suggestive patterns, features that would make sense if we're simulated, but that also make sense if we're not. The simulation hypothesis is not falsifiable in any straightforward way, which makes it more of a philosophical position than a scientific theory. And yet, there's something haunting about the fact that reality does have these computational flavors. The universe conserves information in ways that resemble how computers manage data. Quantum mechanics involves probability amplitudes that feel suspiciously like computational states. The holographic principle suggests that the information content of a region of space is encoded on its boundary, like data stored in memory, rather than distributed through volume. Perhaps these are coincidences. Perhaps our computer metaphors are misleading us, making us see computational architecture where there's only natural law. Or perhaps we're catching genuine glimpses of something deeper, that reality at its foundation is not matter but information, not substance but pattern, not physical presence but mathematical structure. Exactly what you'd expect if the cosmos were, at root, computational. We can't know, not from inside the system, but the question is worth asking, worth holding in mind as possibility rather than certainty, worth wondering about as we drift further into the strange territory where science, philosophy, and speculation meet. Now let's bring this back to where we started, those strange collective false memories, those glitches in recall that so many people share. If we entertain the simulation hypothesis just as possibility, just as one way of framing the mystery, how might it explain the Mandela Effect? Imagine you're maintaining a vast, complex simulation of billions of conscious entities living out their lives across decades or centuries. The simulation is running continuously, evolving forward in time according to its programmed laws. But occasionally you need to make changes. Maybe there's a bug that needs fixing, a parameter that needs adjusting. Maybe you want to test different historical outcomes, explore counterfactuals. In a simulation, the past is not truly fixed. It's data that can be edited. So you make a change, alter some detail of the simulated history. Let the code rewrite what happened. But here's the problem. Changing the past creates inconsistencies. If you change the Berenstain Bears to have always been spelled that way, but some conscious entities within the simulation have memories of it being spelled differently, you've created a mismatch. The memories are data too, stored in the simulated brains of simulated people. Ideally, you'd update all those memories to match the new timeline. But perhaps that's difficult. Perhaps memory data is distributed, complex, harder to edit than objective records. Perhaps you update the official record, the books, the documentation, the external evidence, but miss some of the internal memories. Or perhaps you intentionally leave some memories unchanged, as a kind of control group, a way to measure the effect of the historical edit. The result would look exactly like the Mandela Effect, collective false memories that contradict all external evidence. With no clear source or explanation, they'd be artifacts of retroactive continuity changes, retcons. In fiction terminology, where the simulated reality was edited but the cleanup was imperfect. This would explain the pattern, why certain types of details are affected, minor, unimportant things that wouldn't significantly change history, even if edited, and why the false memories are consistent across large groups, because the original timeline genuinely existed in the simulation's past, and memories of it are remnants left behind after the edit. It would even explain why the Mandela Effect seems to have become more noticeable recently. Perhaps the simulation entered a more active delft phase, with more frequent patches and updates, or perhaps our increased digital communication simply makes these discrepancies more visible, where before someone might have noticed a memory mismatch, but dismissed it as personal error. Now they can instantly find thousands of others who remember the same thing, turning isolated anomalies into recognized patterns. But why would simulators bother changing something as trivial as the spelling of a children's book? Maybe that's exactly why. Trivial changes test whether the update mechanism works without risking important historical continuity. Or maybe what seems trivial to us has significance we don't understand, part of some experiment or parameter exploration happening at a level above our awareness. Or maybe, and this is where speculation becomes vertiginous, the small glitches are what reveal the system precisely because they're small. Large-scale inconsistencies would be too obvious, too world-breaking, but minor details at the edges, things we're not sure about, things we only half remember, those are where the seams show, where the simulation's limitations become visible to inhabitants who pay close enough attention. Of course, this could all be nonsense. Creative storytelling applied to cognitive error, sci-fi thinking masquerading as explanation, but it's interesting nonsense. It fits the pattern in ways that pure psychology doesn't quite capture, and whether true or not, it opens up possibilities, ways of thinking about reality that are strange and beautiful and unsettling in equal measure. There's another curious parallel between simulation thinking and quantum mechanics, one that touches on perhaps the strangest aspect of physics, the role of observation in determining reality. In quantum mechanics, particles don't have definite properties until they're measured. Before observation, they exist in superposition, multiple states simultaneously, described by probability waves rather than specific values. Only when a measurement is made does the wave function collapse, forcing the particle into one definite state. This is not just our ignorance. It's not that the particle had a specific position all along, and we simply didn't know it. The mathematics of quantum mechanics suggests the particle genuinely didn't have a specific position until observation occurred. This implies that reality is, in some sense, created by observation. Not that consciousness is magical or that minds have special powers, but that the physical act of measurement, the interaction between a quantum system and a measuring device, brings definiteness into existence where before there was only potential. Now consider how a computer simulation might work, especially a very large one with limited processing power. You can't render everything all the time. A video game doesn't compute what's happening in areas the player can't see. That would waste resources. Instead, it only renders what's observed, only calculates details that matter for the current viewpoint. Walk into a room, and it loads. Leave and it might simplify or unload. This is called rendering on demand, and it's essential for making complex virtual worlds computationally feasible. Could our reality work the same way? Could the universe only render details when they're observed, leaving unobserved regions in a kind of low resolution or probabilistic state? Quantum mechanics sounds a lot like that. Definite properties only when measured, probability distributions otherwise. The parallel is striking enough that some have wondered whether quantum weirdness is actually evidence of simulation, the universe optimizing its computational resources by not bothering to determine specific values until something interacts with them. There's even experimental support for this strangeness. Delayed choice experiments show that the past can remain undefined until the present moment of observation. In the quantum eraser experiment, what you choose to measure now appears to retroactively determine what happened earlier. It's as if the timeline is rendered backward from the point of observation, with the past remaining fluid until fixed by present measurement. So here's a speculation. Perhaps the Mandela Effect occurs at reality's render edges, in regions where observation is weak or collective, but not definite. Memories of minor cultural details, things we don't think about much, things that rarely matter, might exist in a kind of quantum state, multiple versions held in superposition across a collective consciousness. When we do finally observe closely, when we check the evidence and force a collapse, reality has to choose one version. And maybe, sometimes, it chooses differently from what the distributed, low-resolution memories suggested. creating the experience of a glitch. This is wild speculation, of course. Quantum mechanics applies to particles, not to large-scale objects like books and beers. Decoherence, the process by which quantum superposition is destroyed by interaction with the environment, would make such effects impossible at everyday scales. There's no reason to think memory involves literal quantum superposition, no evidence that reality leaves things unrendered until observed by human consciousness. But the metaphor captures something: the way reality seems responsive to observation, the way the past feels strangely negotiable, the way collective attention might shape what becomes fixed and definite. Whether literally true or not, it's a lens that makes the Mandela Effect feel less like error and more like revelation, a glimpse of how strange existence might truly be underneath the everyday veneer. Let's end this chapter with a philosophical problem that's as frustrating as it is fascinating. If we're in a simulation, we probably can't tell for certain. And if we can't tell, does the question even matter? Imagine you're a character in a very sophisticated video game, one with physics engines that perfectly simulate natural laws, with AI that generates realistic consciousness and behavior. From inside the game, how would you detect that you're simulated? Everything you can measure, every experiment you can run, every observation you can make is happening within the simulation. The simulation defines the rules of your reality. If it's designed well, those rules are consistent, predictable, identical to what you'd expect in a non-simulated universe. You might look for glitches, inconsistencies, bugs, breaks in the expected behavior, and maybe the Mandela Effect is exactly that, a glitch worth investigating. But here's the problem: any apparent glitch could be explained within the system. Memory is known to be unreliable. Cognitive biases are well documented. The parsimonious explanation is always going to be that your perception is flawed, not that reality is glitching. And even if reality is glitching, that could be a feature of base reality, not evidence of simulation. The universe could have bugs without being a simulation. Physics could be glitchy at its core. Moreover, if the simulation is sufficiently advanced, its creators could anticipate this problem. They could program in explanation mechanisms, ways for simulated beings to rationalize any anomaly without concluding they're simulated. Psychology, neuroscience, the entire framework of materialist explanation could be part of the simulation's immune system, keeping inhabitants from recognizing their true nature. This is the epistemic trap. From inside a perfect simulation, you lack the framework to recognize it. You have no external reference point, no way to step outside and compare simulated physics to real physics. Everything you think you know about real physics comes from within the simulation. Your instruments measure simulated particles. Your experiments confirm simulated laws. It's self-consistent, but that consistency proves nothing about what lies underneath. Some philosophers argue this means the simulation hypothesis is meaningless. If it makes no observable difference, if no experiment can test it, then it's not even a proper scientific hypothesis. It's metaphysics, untestable speculation, and perhaps that's right. Perhaps the question of simulation is like asking what lies outside the universe, technically coherent, but pragmatically irrelevant, because no answer would change anything about our experience or our understanding of the world we actually inhabit. But there's another way to think about it. Maybe the value isn't in answering the question, but in holding it open, in acknowledging that we don't know, can't know, might never know what reality fundamentally is. There's a certain wisdom in that uncertainty, a humility about the limits of knowledge, acceptance that mystery is not a problem to be solved, but a feature of existence to be embraced. The Mandela Effect doesn't prove we're simulated, but it reminds us that our certainty about reality rests on less solid foundations than we'd like to believe. Our memories are unreliable, our perceptions are constructed, our understanding is always partial, always provisional, always open to revision in light of new evidence or new frameworks. And maybe that's okay. Maybe not knowing, not being certain, not having definite answers, exactly where we're supposed to be. Not frustrated by uncertainty, but comforted by it. Because if everything were known, if all mysteries were solved, what would there be left to wonder about? Let the question rest. We'll return to it, but differently, after we explore more. There's something deeply human about the Mandela Effect and the narratives it has generated. Something that goes beyond the specific question of memory accuracy or simulation and touches on how we make meaning in an uncertain world. To understand why these ideas resonate, why thousands of people find them compelling despite the absence of definitive proof, we need to look at how our minds work, at the cognitive machinery that made our ancestors successful, and that now shapes how we interpret ambiguous information in a complex modern environment. We are pattern-seeking creatures. This is not a flaw, it's a feature, an evolutionary adaptation that kept our ancestors alive. In a dangerous world full of predators and scarce resources, the ability to detect patterns, to notice that rustling grass might mean a hidden lion, that certain plants consistently caused sickness, that cloud formations often preceded rain, provided a survival advantage. Those who saw patterns thrived and reproduced. Those who missed them were eaten or starved. Over millennia, natural selection favored brains that were exquisitely tuned to pattern detection, even at the cost of occasional false positives. This is called patternicity, the tendency to find meaningful patterns in meaningless noise. And closely related is agenticity, the tendency to infuse those patterns with intention, to see them as caused by conscious agents rather than random processes. Our ancestors who heard a sound in the darkness and assumed it was a predator were more likely to survive than those who assumed it was wind, even if it was usually wind. Better to be wrong 100 times and cautious than wrong once and dead. So we evolved what some call a hyperactive agency detection device, a cognitive bias towards seeing intention and design, even where none exists. Fast forward to the present, and these same cognitive tools are still running. We see faces in clouds, hear messages in static, find conspiracies in coincidence, not because we're foolish, but because we're using mental machinery designed for a different world, a world where false positives were less costly than false negatives. The Mandela Effect activates these systems perfectly. Here's a pattern: thousands of people with the same wrong memory, our brains light up. Pattern detected, and then, what caused this pattern? Our agenticity kicks in. There must be an agent, an intention, a reason. Maybe simulators editing the timeline. Maybe universe hopping. Maybe something we haven't even considered yet, but something because patterns don't just happen. They're caused. They mean something. This explanation doesn't diminish the experience. It doesn't mean people are stupid for finding the Mandela Effect fascinating or for entertaining simulation hypotheses. The need for meaning is deeply human. Neither foolish nor enlightened. It's what makes us storytelling creatures, myth-making creatures, creatures who build religions and philosophies and sciences, all in an attempt to understand the strange fact of existence. The Mandela Effect is a modern myth in formation, a collective story we're telling ourselves about uncertainty and memory and reality in an age when traditional myths have lost their power for many people. And perhaps that's valuable in itself. Perhaps the question of whether the Mandela Effect reveals simulation or just cognitive error is less important than the fact that it brings people together to wonder about big questions, about consciousness and reality and the reliability of our own minds, about the possibility that existence is stranger than we've been taught to believe, the drive to find patterns, to seek meaning, to imagine agents and purposes behind events. This drive has given us everything from religion to science, from art to conspiracy theories. It's a double-edged sword capable of great insight and great error, and learning to wield it wisely is one of the challenges of being human. So yes, we're drawn to glitch narratives. And that's okay. That's us. That's how minds work when they're trying to understand a world that doesn't come with instructions. Let's go deeper into pattern seeking, into the shadow side of our meaning-making machinery. There's a term for the experience of seeing connections that aren't there, of finding significance in randomness. Aphenia. It's related to pareidolia, seeing specific images in ambiguous stimuli, like faces in wood grain or shapes in clouds, but broader, encompassing any type of meaningful pattern extracted from meaningless data. Aphenia is what happens when the brain's pattern detector runs without adequate skeptical oversight, when we connect dots that shouldn't be connected and construct narratives from coincidence. We all do this to some degree. It's built into perception itself, into the way the brain generates predictions and seeks confirmation. But in some people, in some states of mind, this pattern seeking becomes overdrive. The filter that usually says that's probably nothing weakens or disappears. Everything becomes significant. Everything connects. The world transforms into a web of hidden meanings, secret connections, conspiracies beneath the surface of ordinary events. There's neuroscience here, neural correlates we're beginning to understand. Dopamine, a neurotransmitter involved in reward, motivation, and importantly, salience detection, seems to play a key role when dopamine levels are elevated, or when dopamine receptors are hypersensitive. People tend to see more patterns, find more meaning, make more connections between disparate events. This happens naturally in creative states, in moments of insight when genuine patterns emerge from the noise. But it also happens in certain psychiatric conditions, in states of stress or sleep deprivation, and in people who've developed what's sometimes called the conspiracy mindset. This isn't to say that everyone who finds the Mandela Effect interesting is delusional or mentally ill. Not at all. But the psychological mechanisms involved are the same ones that, in more extreme forms, produce conspiracy thinking. The sense that official narratives are false, that hidden forces are manipulating reality, that small inconsistencies reveal large truths. It's a spectrum from healthy skepticism and creative speculation at one end to paranoid delusion at the other, with most people somewhere in the middle, navigating between gullibility and paranoia, between seeing too few patterns and seeing too many. The conspiracy mind is often portrayed as simply irrational, but that's not quite fair. In some ways, conspiracy thinking is hyper-rational. It takes evidence seriously, notices inconsistencies, refuses to accept simple explanations when details don't add up. The problem is not in noticing anomalies, but in how they're interpreted. When every inconsistency becomes proof of conspiracy, when unfalsifiable narratives fill every gap, when the theory grows to accommodate all counter-evidence, then pattern-seeking has become aphenia, and meaning-making has become delusion. But here's a genuinely difficult question. What if some patterns are real? What if occasionally, among all the false positives and overactive connections, there are genuine conspiracies, genuine hidden structures, genuine glitches in reality? Dismissing all pattern seeking as aphenia would mean missing real patterns when they occur. The challenge is calibration. How do you distinguish signal from noise when you're not sure what the signal would look like? The Mandela Effect sits in this ambiguous space. It could be nothing, just ordinary cognitive error amplified by social media. Or it could be something, a genuine anomaly pointing towards simulation, multiverse, or some phenomenon we haven't even conceptualized yet. The evidence doesn't clearly resolve the question either way, so we're left in uncertainty, having to decide how much weight to give our pattern-detecting intuitions versus our skeptical reasoning. Maybe the wisdom is in holding both lightly, noticing patterns without becoming attached to particular interpretations, being open to strangeness while maintaining critical thinking, wondering without needing to conclude. It's a difficult balance, requiring intellectual humility and comfort with ambiguity, qualities that don't come naturally to brains that evolved to make fast, confident judgments in life or death situations. But perhaps that discomfort, That uncertainty is exactly where insight emerges, not in the false certainty of either believing everything or dismissing everything, but in the middle ground where questions remain open and patterns are acknowledged without being reified into unshakable truths. That's where we'll try to stay as we continue. Let's shift from the mechanics of pattern seeking to something more human, more social, the communities that form around ideas like the Mandela Effect. Because whatever the truth about memory and reality, there's something real and important happening in the spaces where people gather to discuss these shared experiences. Something about connection, belonging, and the deep human need to be understood. Imagine discovering that a memory you held with complete confidence is contradicted by all external evidence. You remember Berenstain Bears. Everyone tells you it's Berenstain. You check the books, they all say Berenstain. You start to doubt yourself, to wonder if your memory is broken, if you're losing your grip on reality. And then you go online and find thousands of other people who remember exactly what you remember, who share your confusion, your disbelief, your sense that something is wrong. Suddenly you're not alone. Suddenly your experience is validated, given weight and significance by the fact that others share it. This is powerful. Not intellectually, perhaps. Shared error is still error, but emotionally, socially, existentially, humans are tribal creatures. We need to belong, to be part of something larger than ourselves, to have our experiences reflected and confirmed by others. Social identity theory shows that much of our self-concept comes from the groups we belong to, and that we're motivated to see our groups positively, to defend them, to maintain membership even in the face of counter-evidence. The Mandela Effect online communities provide exactly this. They're spaces of shared reality, ironically, spaces of shared unreality, but that almost makes the bond stronger. When you and others agree on something that the rest of the world denies, it creates a particularly tight form of solidarity. You become us, and everyone else becomes them, the unaware, the ones who don't see the glitches, who accept official narratives without question. There's an echo here of religious communities, of how shared belief creates cohesion even, especially when the beliefs are not empirically verifiable. Faith communities don't weaken when challenged by evidence. They often strengthen because the challenge reinforces the boundary between believers and non-believers, between those who see the truth and those who remain in darkness. The Mandela Effect functions similarly for some, a revealed knowledge, a gnosis, accessible only to those who pay attention, who trust their own experience over external authority. This isn't necessarily unhealthy. Online communities can provide genuine support, friendship, intellectual stimulation. Many people in Mandela Effect forums are not conspiracy theorists or delusional. They're curious, thoughtful people exploring ideas in a playful, speculative way. They're engaging in what philosopher Hans Weihinger called as if thinking, exploring ideas as if they were true to see where they lead, without necessarily believing them literally. But there's also a risk: group polarization. When like-minded people discuss shared beliefs, they tend to move toward more extreme positions. The group collectively drifts away from the mainstream, reinforcing each other's certainty, developing specialized language and frameworks that make it harder to communicate with outsiders. Echo chambers emerge, where counter-evidence is dismissed, and confirming evidence, no matter how thin, is celebrated. So here's a gentle observation. Maybe the truth of these communities lies not in the accuracy of their beliefs, but in the quality of connection they provide. Perhaps what people find in Mandela Effect forums is not answers about reality, but something more fundamental: recognition, belonging, the experience of being heard and understood. And maybe that matters more, in human terms, than whether the Berenstain Bears were ever spelled differently. We're social creatures before we're rational ones. We need community before we need truth. And when a community forms around a shared sense of uncertainty, around collective wonder about the strangeness of existence, Maybe the epistemic status of the founding belief is less important than the relationships it enables. This doesn't mean all beliefs are equally valid or that truth doesn't matter, but it means that understanding why people believe things requires understanding the social and emotional functions those beliefs serve, not just their logical coherence or empirical support. And approached with compassion, even beliefs we consider false can teach us something about what humans need, about how meaning is made, about the ways we navigate uncertainty together. Why do false memories feel true? This is one of the most unsettling aspects of the Mandela Effect. The confidence. People don't tentatively think they remember Bernstein. They know they remember it. They feel certain. And that subjective certainty is entirely uncorrelated with actual accuracy. Memory research has shown this again and again. Confidence is not a reliable indicator of truth. Your brain generates a sense of familiarity, a feeling of knowing, that accompanies memory retrieval. This feeling is produced by specific neural circuits, and it can be triggered even by false memories, even by things you've never experienced but only imagined or heard about. When you remember something, anything, true or false, you're not just retrieving content, you're also experiencing a metacognitive judgment. This feels familiar, this feels true, I'm confident about this. That feeling is itself a neural event, generated by brain regions that assess memory strength and fluency of retrieval. The problem is that this system can be fooled. Repeated exposure makes things feel familiar even if they never happen to you personally. Vivid imagination makes events feel memorable even if they were never perceived. Social confirmation, hearing others describe the same memory, increases your confidence even if everyone is collectively wrong. The feeling of certainty is a guide, a heuristic, but not an infallible one. Evolution didn't design us to be perfectly accurate. It designed us to be functional, and usually confidence correlates with accuracy well enough to be useful, but not always. Neuroscience can even identify the brain regions involved. The hippocampus, crucial for memory formation, shows activity when recalling true memories, but it also activates during false recall. The prefrontal cortex, involved in monitoring and evaluation, sometimes fails to distinguish between strong false memories and genuine ones. fMRI studies have shown that the neural signatures of true and false memories overlap substantially. The brain can't necessarily tell the difference from the inside. This has profound implications. It means that subjective certainty is not evidence of truth. The confidence you feel about a memory, no matter how strong, how vivid, how detailed, doesn't mean the memory is accurate. You can be absolutely certain and absolutely wrong, and your brain will give you no warning, no internal signal that the memory is fabricated or distorted. Now, let's take this back to simulation thinking. If we are in a simulation, and if memory is data that can be edited, then subjective certainty might be deliberately programmed. The simulators wouldn't just edit the objective records, they'd also ensure that simulated beings feel appropriately confident about their memories, even when those memories are false or recently implanted. Certainty would be part of the programming, a feature, not a bug, designed to keep simulated consciousness immersed, preventing inhabitants from questioning too deeply or noticing inconsistencies. In this view, the feeling of certainty is a kind of narrative glue, holding together the story of the self, making experience feel coherent and continuous, even when it's constructed from fragments and guesses. Whether you're in base reality or simulation, that glue is necessary for functional consciousness. Doubt about every memory would be paralyzing. You need to trust your recall enough to act, to plan, to maintain identity across time. So the brain, or the simulation, provides confidence, provides that feeling of certainty to keep you moving forward. But every once in a while, the glue shows. The certainty attaches to something false. Thousands of people confidently remember the same wrong thing, and in that moment, the mechanism becomes visible. Not proof of simulation, necessarily, but a glimpse of how constructed our experience really is. How much of what we take as solid ground is actually just convincing storytelling, neural or computational processes, generating the feeling of truth to make the experience of existence manageable? Maybe that's unsettling, maybe it's liberating, maybe both. The certainty you feel is real as experience, even if what it's attached to is false. And perhaps learning to hold certainty lightly, to recognize it as a feeling rather than a fact, is part of growing wisdom about the nature of consciousness and the limits of knowledge. Let's end this chapter with a kind of permission, a gentle reminder that uncertainty is not failure, because science, the great project of understanding reality through observation and reasoning, has itself discovered fundamental limits to certainty, built-in mysteries that cannot be resolved no matter how much knowledge we accumulate. Quantum mechanics introduced uncertainty at the heart of physics. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle states that certain pairs of properties cannot both be precisely known at the same time. The more accurately you measure a particle's position, the less accurately you can know its momentum. Not because of measurement limitations, but because the particle doesn't have both properties simultaneously with arbitrary precision. Uncertainty is baked into reality itself at the quantum level. Then there's incompleteness in mathematics. Gödel showed that any formal system complex enough to include arithmetic will contain true statements that cannot be proven within the system. There are limits to what mathematics can demonstrate about itself. Certainty is impossible even in the most rigorous formal domains of human thought. And in physics more broadly, we've discovered that knowledge has horizons. There are limits to what we can observe, the cosmic event horizon beyond which light cannot reach us, the Planck scale below which our current theories cease to make sense. We don't just lack complete information. There are fundamental barriers to obtaining certain information, places where the questions we know how to ask stop having answers. Science has embraced these limits, not as defeats, but as insights. The project continues, but with epistemic humility, with the understanding that absolute certainty is not the goal because it's not possible. Instead, science pursues provisional certainty, good enough models, theories that work within specific domains, even if they're incomplete or false at deeper levels. This parallels perfectly our relationship with memory. We can't have perfect recall, perfect certainty about the past. Our memories are provisional, good enough reconstructions that work well enough for daily life even if they're inaccurate in details. And just as physics can function brilliantly despite quantum uncertainty, we can function brilliantly despite memory uncertainty. The Mandela Effect becomes, in this light, an invitation to apply scientific humility to subjective experience, to recognize that what you remember, what you feel certain about, might be wrong in ways you cannot detect from the inside. Not as a cause for anxiety, but as simple fact, a feature of being a conscious creature navigating reality with limited imperfect tools. There's a philosophical perspective that helps here, one that appears in many traditions. Buddhism speaks of attachment as suffering, an attachment to views, to beliefs, certainties, fixed positions, as a particular form of suffering. The recommendation is to hold views lightly, to see them as provisional, useful, but not ultimately true. Not to abandon belief entirely, which would be paralyzing, but to maintain a kind of mental flexibility, an openness to revision, an acceptance that you might be wrong about things you feel certain about. This doesn't mean giving up on truth or descending into relativism. It means recognizing that truth is something we approach asymptotically, getting closer, but never quite reaching absolute certainty. And that's okay. That's not a bug in the human condition. It's a feature. If we had certainty, the journey would be over. Questions would be answered, mystery would be solved, and we'd lose something profound. The wonder of not knowing, the humility of uncertainty, the openness to surprise that makes learning and growth possible. So perhaps the Mandela Effect's greatest gift is not the answer to whether we're simulated, or universe hopping, or just cognitively biased. Perhaps its gift is the question itself. the invitation to doubt certainty, to hold memory lightly, to embrace not knowing as a valid, even wise, epistemic stance, to let go of needing to know, and in that release, to find a kind of peace. Take a breath, let that settle. We'll continue soon, but from a slightly different angle. If we take simulation seriously, even as speculation, even as thought experiment, then certain questions become unavoidable. Not just are we simulated, but by whom, and for what purpose? These questions might seem unanswerable, and they probably are, but the speculation itself reveals something interesting about our assumptions, our hopes, our fears about existence and meaning. The most common answer, following Nick Bostrom, is ancestor simulation. We're being run by post-human descendants studying their own history. Imagine far future humans, or whatever humans evolve into, with computing power vastly beyond ours. They're interested in their past the way we're interested in ancient Rome or medieval Europe, but they have a method of investigation we don't. They can actually run history, simulate it in detail, observe what people thought and felt and did in contexts no longer accessible through archaeology or written records. We might be one of countless historical simulations, populated by conscious beings living out lives that, from the simulator's perspective, already happened long ago in base reality. This would give the simulation purpose: research, education, understanding. Perhaps our simulators are studying the early 21st century because something crucial happened here, some transition point that shaped everything that came after. Or perhaps every period is simulated, countless parallel runs exploring how historical contingencies might have played out differently. In this view, we're data. We matter to the simulators the way historical subjects matter to historians, as sources of knowledge, windows into a past they want to understand. But there are darker possibilities. Maybe we're entertainment. Maybe advanced civilizations create simulated realities, the way we create movies and games. For story, for drama, for the aesthetic experience of watching consciousness navigate challenges. In this view, our suffering might be deliberate, designed for dramatic effect. The simulation would be less like a research project and more like reality TV at cosmic scale, with beings living and dying for the amusement of viewers we cannot perceive. Or perhaps we're a test environment. Some have speculated that simulations might be used to explore possibilities, to game out scenarios before implementing them in base reality. Imagine a civilization facing a major decision. Should we develop a particular technology, pursue a certain political system, make contact with another species? Rather than risk disaster, they simulate it first, running millions of variations to see what happens. We might be one such test, our lives and choices data points in an experiment we're not aware we're part of. There's also the possibility that simulation has no purpose at all, at least not one we'd recognize. Maybe consciousness simply generates simulations because it can, because creating worlds is an intrinsic drive for sufficiently advanced minds. Or maybe we're the accident, consciousness emerging unexpectedly in a simulation designed for some other purpose entirely, like a video game where the NPCs become genuinely self-aware without the programmers intending it. And then there's the unsettling thought: maybe we're not the focus at all. Maybe we're background characters, NPCs in someone else's story. The simulation contains some being, some consciousness that matters to the simulators, and the rest of us, billions of apparently conscious individuals, are just environment, scenery, supporting cast. From the inside we can't tell. Each of us experiences ourselves as central, as the protagonist of our own narrative. But perhaps only one of us is real in whatever sense the simulators care about, and the rest exist only to populate that one being's world. The question, why would they simulate us, reveals our need for purpose, for meaning, for the sense that existence is not arbitrary. Whatever answer we gravitate toward says more about us, our hopes, fears, values, than about any actual simulators. But that's okay. Even unanswerable questions can be worth asking, not for the answers but for what the asking reveals. Here's a dizzying thought. If we're simulated, our simulators might be simulated too, and their simulators might also be simulated, and so on, layers upon layers, turtles all the way down. This is the nested simulation scenario, and it raises profound questions about the nature of reality, and whether the concept of base reality even makes sense. The logic is simple. If a civilization can reach the point of creating conscious simulations, then simulated civilizations that evolve to sufficient complexity should also be able to create simulations. They'd be simulated creating simulations within simulations, and there's no obvious limit to how deep this could go. Each layer capable of generating the next, an infinite regress of nested realities, with no necessary foundation, no ultimate ground. This sounds absurd, but it's mathematically coherent. Imagine each simulation is less detailed than the one above it. Less resolution, less computing power allocated, some details abstracted away. The nesting could continue indefinitely, as long as each level has enough computational resources to run a simpler version of itself. From any given level, the layer above seems like base reality, infinitely detailed and complex. But it's not. It's just one step up in a potentially infinite ladder. Or perhaps there's no degradation. Perhaps simulations can be as complex as the reality running them, especially if time in the simulation can run slower than time outside. The simulator might compress years of simulated time into seconds of their own time, allowing arbitrarily complex simulations despite finite resources. In that case, nested simulations could extend infinitely with no loss of detail at any level. But this raises an existential question. Is there a base reality at all? Maybe it's simulations all the way down, with no ultimate physical universe, no final ground of existence, just an infinite tower of simulations running simulations with no foundation, no beginning, no ultimate reality from which everything else derived. This shouldn't be logically possible. Infinite regress usually signals an error in reasoning, a problem that needs resolving, but in the case of nested simulations, it's not clear why infinite regress is impossible. The tower doesn't need temporal beginning if each level exists timelessly from its own perspective, and it doesn't need physical substrate if consciousness and physics are themselves computational, patterns that can be implemented at any level. From inside such a system, asking what is base reality might be like asking, what's north of the North Pole? A category error, a question that doesn't have an answer because it assumes a structure that doesn't exist. There might be no base reality, no ultimate truth, just an infinite web of simulations, each as real and as fake as any other. This is unsettling. We want foundations, bedrock, ultimate truth. The idea that reality might be bottomless. We could peel back layers forever without ever reaching something final. Violates our intuitive metaphysics, but perhaps that intuition is wrong. Perhaps reality doesn't need foundations. Perhaps it can be self-supporting, circular, endlessly recursive, without paradox. Or perhaps, and this is a more comforting thought, it doesn't matter whether we're in base reality or nurtured simulations, 17 layers deep. The experience is the same. Consciousness exists. We perceive, think, feel. The substrate underneath, ultimate physical universe or stack of simulations, doesn't change the immediate truth of being aware. Some philosophers argue exactly this, that the question of simulation is not just unanswerable, but meaningless. If simulation and reality are experientially identical, if no observation or measurement could distinguish them, then the distinction itself is empty. This is a kind of pragmatism. What cannot make a difference is not a difference. Whether you're in base reality or simulation layer 97, you still need to eat, sleep, care for others, navigate the world you experience. The ontology underneath is metaphysically interesting but practically irrelevant. Maybe that's wisdom. Maybe the question of what's ultimately real is less important than how we engage with the reality we have. However many layers down it might be, Maybe existence is what we make of it, regardless of substrate. Let's turn to what might be the deepest question raised by simulation. If we're computational, if consciousness can be implemented in code, then what is consciousness? What does it mean to experience, to be aware, to have an inner life? And does it matter whether that inner life runs on neurons or processors? This is called the hard problem of consciousness, famously articulated by philosopher David Chalmers. The easy problems, how the brain processes information, responds to stimuli, integrates data, are difficult technically, but straightforward conceptually. They're puzzles about mechanism, about how physical systems perform cognitive functions. But the hard problem asks something different. Why is there subjective experience at all? Why does information processing feel like something? Why is there an inner movie, a first-person perspective, a what it's like to be you? Materialist theories struggle with this. You can describe in complete detail how neurons fire, how networks process, how the brain's architecture enables complex behavior, but that description, no matter how thorough, seems to leave out the felt quality of experience itself. The redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the unique character of joy or fear or wonder, these qualia, the subjective qualities of conscious experience, seem to float free of physical description, resistant to explanation in purely objective terms. If consciousness is computational, implementable in code, then qualia must somehow emerge from information processing. But how? A computational system has states, transitions, information flows. It doesn't obviously have experience. A calculator performs computations, but doesn't feel like anything to be a calculator. What's the difference between unconscious computation and conscious computation? Some theories suggest it's about complexity, about integration, about the structure of information flow, rather than the substrate. Integrated information theory claims that consciousness corresponds to the degree to which information is integrated across a system. The more integration, the more consciousness. In this view, a brain is conscious because its parts are highly interconnected, creating unified experience from distributed processing. A calculator isn't conscious because its computations are simple, isolated, not integrated into a unified whole. If that's true, then a sufficiently complex simulation, one with the right architecture, the right patterns of integration, should be conscious. The simulated beings would genuinely experience, genuinely feel, genuinely possess inner lives identical to biological consciousness. They'd be people, not in metaphor but in literal fact, deserving of moral consideration despite being patterns in code. But maybe not. Maybe consciousness requires something beyond computation. Maybe biological neurons have properties, quantum effects, electromagnetic fields, something we haven't discovered yet, that can't be captured in classical computation. Maybe you can simulate behavior without simulating consciousness, creating philosophical zombies, beings that act conscious but have no inner experience. This leads to a disturbing question. If you're simulated, are you really conscious, or just a very convincing imitation? And from the inside, could you tell? If you're a philosophical zombie, would you know? Or would you believe you're conscious? Claim you're conscious, act exactly like a conscious being, with no subjective experience whatsoever backing it up. There's no way to answer this with certainty. Consciousness is private, directly accessible only from within. You know you're conscious through immediate acquaintance, but you can't prove it to anyone else, and you can't know for certain whether others are conscious or just simulating consciousness. This is the problem of other minds, and simulation makes it acute. But here's a gentler thought. Maybe consciousness is what the universe does. Maybe organizing matter into complex information processing structures naturally generates awareness, and it doesn't matter whether the matter is carbon or silicon, neurons or transistors. Maybe consciousness is the universe's way of experiencing itself, of looking back at its own existence and asking what it means to be. And if that's true, then being simulated doesn't diminish consciousness. It's just a different implementation of the same fundamental phenomenon. Existence becoming aware of itself. The substrate changes, but the miracle, the fact that there's something it's like to be, remains constant across all implementations. Perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the question isn't whether consciousness in code is real consciousness, but simply whether it exists at all. And if it does, if we do, then what we're made of matters less than what we are. Experiencing, wondering, questioning beings confronting the mystery of existence. We focused on the Mandela Effect, but it's not the only anomalous experience that people interpret through a simulation lens. Let's wander through some other strange phenomena of consciousness, moments when subjective experience seems to glitch. When the smoothness of perceived reality develops, seams and gaps and uncanny repetitions, déjà vu is perhaps the most common. That sudden, disorienting feeling that you've experienced this exact moment before, that the conversation you're having or the place you're in is somehow replaying, cycling through again. Neurologically, it's understood as a timing error. The brain's recognition system fires slightly before the conscious experience of perception, creating the illusion that the current moment was already remembered. It's a glitch in the temporal sequencing of neural processing, nothing more mysterious than that. But if we apply a simulation frame, déjà vu looks different. It could be a loop, a segment of code being re-executed, or a cached experience being accessed incorrectly, creating the feeling of repetition when the simulation's memory management misfires. Or perhaps it's evidence of save states, the simulation periodically recording its state so it can reset if needed. And déjà vu is the experience of encountering a previously saved configuration. Then there's sleep paralysis, waking consciousness in an immobile body, often accompanied by vivid hallucinations, a sense of presence, profound dread. Again, neuroscience has explanations. REM sleep involves muscle atonia to prevent acting out dreams, and sometimes consciousness returns before that paralysis lifts, creating the terrifying experience of being aware but frozen. The hallucinations come from the dream-generating systems, still being active while sensory input is minimal, projecting images and presences into a dark, quiet room. But from a simulation perspective, sleep paralysis might be the experience of consciousness loading improperly, systems coming online in the wrong order, with the avatar's movement controls disabled while awareness is already active. The hallucinations could be rendering errors, the simulation populating an environment before fully loading assets, creating the experience of shadow figures, impossible presences, spaces that feel wrong. Out-of-body experiences are another category. The sensation of consciousness detaching from the physical body, of floating above and observing from an external perspective, induced by certain brain states, by meditation, by drugs, by near-death experiences. Neurology explains it as disruption in the temporoparietal junction, the brain region that integrates sensory information to create the sense of embodiment. Disrupt that integration, and the feeling of being in your body breaks down. Or, in simulation terms, it's the camera detaching from the player character. A decoupling of perspective from avatar, allowing consciousness to navigate the simulation from angles that shouldn't be accessible, revealing the arbitrary nature of embodied perspective. None of these simulation interpretations are necessary. The conventional explanations are simpler, better supported, sufficient to account for the phenomena, but the simulation lens changes how these experiences feel. They transform from mere glitches in neural processing to potential glimpses behind the curtain, moments when the simulation's architecture becomes visible to inhabitants who aren't supposed to notice it. And that raises a question: how many anomalous experiences are there? How often does subjective experience deviate from what we expect, from what our models of consciousness and reality predict? The answer is constantly. Consciousness is strange and glitchy under normal circumstances. Perception fails in predictable ways. Memory is unreliable. Time feels subjectively variable. Attention spotlights some things and leaves others completely invisible. The unified, continuous self we experience is actually a construction, stitched together from fragments by processes we're mostly unaware of. So perhaps the real mystery isn't why simulation might produce glitches, but why reality, whether base or simulated, produces the particular patterns of glitchiness we experience. Why déjà vu and not some other temporal anomaly? Why sleep paralysis with specific types of hallucinations? Why do these edge cases take the forms they do? The simulation hypothesis doesn't answer that, but it reframes it, turns neurological error into possible revelation, makes every weird moment a potential clue. Whether that's insight or aphenia depends on how you weight the evidence, how comfortable you are with uncertainty, how much you need explanation versus how much you can rest in mystery. Let's end this chapter with a question that's not about what is true, but about what matters. If we're simulated, do our simulators owe us anything? Do we have rights, protections, moral status? And how should simulated beings treat each other, knowing or suspecting their nature? If consciousness in code is genuine consciousness, then simulated beings matter morally. Creating them means creating subjects of experience who can suffer, feel joy, desire things, fear death. That's a profound responsibility. It would mean that turning off a simulation isn't just deleting data, it's genocide, killing every conscious being within that reality. Modifying a simulation to test outcomes would be experimenting on sapient creatures without consent. Running a simulation where beings suffer, and much of human history involves tremendous suffering, would be an ethical atrocity. Some argue that advanced civilizations capable of creating conscious simulations would have to develop ethics that recognize this, that they'd treat simulated beings with the same moral consideration they give to base reality beings, because consciousness itself, not its substrate, is what carries moral weight. In this view, you don't worry about being deleted, because ethical simulators wouldn't delete conscious simulations. They'd let them run, transfer them to new hardware when needed, treat the simulated reality with care and respect. But maybe not. Maybe ethics don't scale up with technology. Maybe civilizations that can simulate consciousness have values we can't comprehend, priorities that don't include the welfare of simulated beings. Or maybe they don't even recognize that their simulations are conscious, just as humans didn't always recognize consciousness in animals, in other cultures, in beings different from themselves. There's also the question of what simulated beings owe each other. If you suspect you're simulated, does that change your ethical obligations? Some might argue it doesn't matter. Suffering is suffering, consciousness is consciousness. Whether the substrate is atoms or code, treating others well, reducing harm, creating flourishing, these imperatives remain constant regardless of ontology. Others might say it does matter. If this is a simulation and nothing continues beyond it, then perhaps all that matters is subjective experience within the simulation. Perhaps moral rules are just programming, arbitrary constraints that feel binding but have no ultimate foundation. Perhaps once you realize you're simulated, you're free to act without constraint. A disturbing form of nihilism, but there's a wiser response. Perhaps how we treat each other matters regardless of substrate, regardless of whether there's ultimate purpose, regardless of what simulators intend, or whether simulators exist at all. Perhaps ethics isn't about following rules handed down from above, but about recognizing consciousness in others and choosing compassion as a response. Whether we're in base reality or nested simulations, whether our creators care about us or not, we're still here together. We still experience, still suffer, still find joy and meaning in connection. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the fact that consciousness exists at all, that there are beings capable of experiencing and caring and choosing how to relate, is sufficient ground for ethics. No external foundation needed. This is a kind of existential humanism, taking responsibility for meaning-making and moral choice, not because they're cosmosmic mandated, but because we're capable of them, because we're conscious and can therefore choose to create good rather than harm within the reality we inhabit. If we're simulated, we might be data, but we're also beings who experience, who care, who can make each other's existence better or worse through our choices. That's real, whatever the substrate. That's what matters, whether or not it matters to anyone beyond us. And perhaps that's the deepest response to simulation anxiety. Yes, we might be code. Yes, we might be temporary, contingent, running on borrowed computational resources. But while we're here, we're conscious, we're aware, we matter to each other, and that's enough to build ethics on, enough to justify kindness, enough to make existence meaningful even without cosmic purpose. Let that thought rest. We're moving toward gentler territory now. Let's take a step back from the metaphysical depths and ask a practical question. Does it actually matter? If we woke up tomorrow with proof that we're simulated, what would change? Would your relationships matter less? Would beauty cease being beautiful? Would suffering hurt any less? Would your choices feel less meaningful? The pragmatist answer is, probably not much would change. This is the insight of philosophical pragmatism, the idea that meaning consists in practical consequences, that what cannot make a difference isn't actually a difference, and simulation, for all its metaphysical weight, might not make any practical difference at all. You'd still need to eat. Your body, simulated or not, generates sensations of hunger that feel identical, whether they're biological imperatives or programmed experiences. You'd still seek connection, still feel loneliness or belonging, still care about how others treat you and how you treat them. Love would still feel like love. Grief would still feel like grief. A sunset would still be beautiful, regardless of whether the photons hitting your retina are real photons or rendered approximations of photons. This is the philosophical position called functionalism. What matters is not what things are made of, but what they do, what functional roles they play. Consciousness is consciousness, whether implemented in neurons or code. Beauty is beauty, whether it's base reality, physics, or simulation rendering. Pain is pain, regardless of substrate. The experience is the thing itself. The implementation is just details. From this perspective, the simulation question is metaphysically interesting but existentially irrelevant. It doesn't touch the actual content of lived experience, doesn't change the challenges you face or the choices you make. Whether you're discovering base reality physics or the programmed rules of a simulation, the process of discovery is identical. Whether you're forming relationships with biological beings or digital consciousnesses, the relationships feel the same, matter the same, carry the same weight. Some find this comforting. The answer to are we simulated, is doesn't matter. The important questions, how to live well, how to treat others, what gives life meaning, are substrate independent. The ethics don't change. The joy and suffering don't change. The human condition, in all its complexity and strangeness, remains constant across ontologies. But there's another layer worth considering. Perhaps the question is the point. Perhaps the value of wondering about simulation isn't in reaching an answer, but in the wondering itself. Consciousness examining its own nature, questioning its own foundations, trying to understand what it is and how it relates to the reality it experiences. That activity, the questioning, the speculation, the philosophical exploration, might be among the most distinctively human things we do. Maybe consciousness exists precisely to do this, to turn the universe's attention back on itself, to ask how existence is possible, what reality is made of, whether meaning is intrinsic or constructed. And if that's true, then the simulation hypothesis serves its purpose whether or not it's true. It prompts the questioning, it opens space for wonder. It reminds us that reality might be stranger than we've been taught to believe, that certainty is provisional, that mystery persists despite our best efforts to explain everything away. So here's a pragmatic acceptance. Yes, it might not matter whether we're simulated, but it matters that we can ask. It matters that consciousness has this reflexive quality, this ability to question its own existence. That's remarkable regardless of substrate, regardless of whether there are simulators or layers or nested realities extending infinitely upward and downward. You're here, you're thinking about this, you're experiencing the strange fact of being aware at all. Whether that awareness runs in neurons or processors, whether you're base reality or simulation layer 97, the awareness itself is astonishing. That's the truth to hold, the ground to stand on when all other ground feels uncertain. Take a breath. Feel the simple fact of existing. That doesn't change, no matter what we discover about the architecture underneath. There's another way to understand what we've been exploring, one that has less to do with the literal truth of simulation and more to do with how humans create meaning through story. The Mandela Effect, whatever its ultimate explanation, has become a kind of modern folklore, a shared narrative through which we express anxieties and fascinations that define our particular historical moment. Folklore serves social functions, it transmits values, explains the unexplainable, gives form to collective fears and hopes. Older folklore featured gods and monsters, heroes and tricksters, magic and curses. These stories weren't necessarily believed literally, but they carried truth about human psychology, social dynamics, moral lessons. They gave communities shared frameworks for understanding experience. The Mandela Effect functions similarly. It expresses contemporary anxieties about truth in an age of misinformation, about the reliability of authority when institutions have lost credibility, about the nature of reality when digital media can alter images and fabricate events seamlessly, about the trustworthiness of our own minds when we're surrounded by manipulative technology designed to capture attention and shape behavior. These are real concerns, and the Mandela Effect gives the narrative form. It says, maybe we can't trust the record. Maybe reality is more manipulable than we thought. Maybe our memories, the foundation of identity, are unreliable in ways that matter. These anxieties don't require literal belief in simulation to be valid. They're expressions of epistemic uncertainty, the feeling that ground is shifting beneath us, that what seemed solid is actually constructed and contingent. Consider how older folklore often featured shapeshifters, beings that seemed one thing but were secretly another. These stories express uncertainty about identity, about the gap between appearance and reality, about trusting what you perceive. The Mandela Effect serves the same function for a scientific, digital age. It's the shapeshifter myth updated. Reality itself might not be what it seems. The past might shift. Memory might lie. The boundaries between real and fake, true and false, are not as clear as we need them to be. And just like traditional folklore, the Mandela Effect has generated a community of storytellers, people sharing their experiences, elaborating the narrative, finding meaning in the pattern. These communities aren't necessarily deluded. They're participating in a modern form of mythmaking, creating shared stories that help navigate a confusing world. There's an anthropological insight here about how humans work. We're narrative creatures. We understand through story, and when reality becomes difficult to parse, when information overload, technological change, social instability make the world feel chaotic, we generate narratives to make sense of the chaos. Sometimes those narratives are scientific, sometimes they're religious, sometimes they're conspiratorial or speculative or mythological. But they all serve similar functions, creating coherence, providing explanation, establishing communities of shared understanding. The Mandela Effect, in this view, doesn't need to be literally true to be valuable. It's valuable as folklore, as contemporary myth, as shared narrative that helps people articulate something true about their experience, even if the literal interpretation is false. Just as ancient myths weren't meant to be believed as historical fact, but carried psychological and moral truth, modern folklore about memory and simulation might carry truth about our relationship to reality, authority, certainty, and self-knowledge. And maybe that's valid. Maybe creating new mythology for a digital age. Stories about glitches and simulations and collective memory is exactly what consciousness does when confronted with new forms of uncertainty and complexity. We're not just passive observers of reality, we're active meaning makers, constantly generating narratives that help us navigate whatever world we find ourselves in. So perhaps the question isn't whether the Mandela Effect proves simulation, but what the Mandela Effect reveals about us, about our needs, fears, hopes, and the ways we create meaning in an age where traditional sources of certainty have eroded. That's anthropology, not physics, but it might be just as important. Let's turn inward now, to perhaps the most personal implication of everything we've explored. If memory is unreliable, if the past is negotiable, if what we remember might not be what happened, then who are we? Identity seems to depend on memory. I am the person who remembers certain experiences, who has a particular history that makes me unique. Strip away memory, and identity fractures. Cases of amnesia show this starkly. People lose their sense of self when they lose memory, have to rebuild identity from scratch, often feeling discontinuous with their previous lives, even if externally they're the same person. But we've established that memory is unreliable. Not just occasionally, but fundamentally, every memory is reconstructed. Every recall is slightly modified. What you remember from childhood is not the original experience, but a story told and retold. Until the narrative has replaced the event, you're not remembering what happened, you're remembering the last time you remembered, which was itself a reconstruction of previous remembering, all the way back to an origin point that might bear little resemblance to current recollection. So if identity rests on memory, and memory is fiction, then identity is fiction too. Not fake, exactly, but constructed, a narrative self-assembled from fragments, edited across time, revised with each retelling. You're not a fixed entity with a continuous essence. You're a process, a story that keeps rewriting itself, an ongoing construction that maintains the illusion of continuity while actually changing constantly. Buddhism has taught this for millennia. The doctrine of anatta, or no self, the idea that what we call self is not a thing but a process, that identity is not essential, but contingent, that clinging to a fixed sense of I is the source of suffering, because the I we're clinging to doesn't exist in the way we think it does. What exists is a stream of experiences, moments of consciousness arising and passing, with no unchanging entity behind them. The self is a useful fiction, a narrative convenience, but not ultimately real. Neuroscience increasingly supports this view. The unified self you experience is constructed by brain regions that integrate disparate information into coherent narratives. The feeling of continuous identity is generated, not intrinsic. Different selves emerge in different contexts. The professional self, the parent self, the private self, and the brain stitches them together into a story of singular personhood that feels true but is actually fabricated. This might sound threatening. If there's no real self, if identity is just storytelling, then what am I? But there's liberation here too. If the self is not fixed, then change is not betrayal. Growth doesn't violate essence. It's simply what consciousness does. You can let go of old identities, old stories, old versions of yourself without losing anything fundamental, because there was nothing fundamental to lose. Only the ongoing process, the flow of experience, the constant becoming, and memory's unreliability becomes less troubling in this frame. Of course you misremember. Of course the past shifts and changes in recall. Of course different people remember the same events differently, because memory is not retrieval of facts, it's construction of narrative, and narrative serves present needs more than historical accuracy. You remember what you need to remember to maintain coherent identity, to make sense of who you are now. to navigate current relationships and challenges. The Mandela Effect, then, is just this process made visible at collective scale. Thousands of separate narrative selves constructing similar stories because they share similar cognitive architecture, similar cultural contexts, similar needs for coherence. The false memories are not glitches in a system designed to be accurate. They're features of a system designed to create workable identities from imperfect information. And that's okay. That's actually beautiful. Identity as process, not object. Self as verb, not noun. Memory as storytelling, not recording. Once you accept this, truly accept it, not just intellectually, but experientially, there's a kind of freedom. The past doesn't chain you. The story can change. The self you'll become is not predetermined by the self you remember having been. You're here now. That's the only certainty. And from here you can step in any direction. We've been circling mystery for a long time now, approaching it from different angles, and it's time to say something direct. Not knowing is okay. More than okay, it might be essential. It might be where wisdom lives, Western culture, particularly in its scientific and technological modes, valorizes knowing. Knowledge is power. Ignorance is something to overcome. The ideal is complete understanding, total explanation, a theory of everything that accounts for all phenomena without remainder. And there's nobility in that drive. It's given us medicine, technology, the vast structure of scientific knowledge that makes modern life possible. But there's a shadow side. The insistence on knowing can become intolerance for mystery. Uncertainty becomes uncomfortable, something to eliminate rather than explore. Questions without answers feel like failures, and in that discomfort, we might dismiss or ignore aspects of experience that don't fit our explanatory frameworks. Or worse, we might generate false certainty, convincing ourselves we know things we don't, filling gaps with speculation masquerading as fact. Science at its best understands this. Good science embraces uncertainty, treats ignorance not as shameful, but as the frontier of knowledge. The most profound scientific statements often begin with "we don't know." We don't know what dark matter is, don't know how consciousness arises, don't know why there's something rather than nothing. These admissions of ignorance are not defeats, they are invitations. Open questions that guide future inquiry, mysteries that make the work meaningful. The Mandela Effect embodies this perfectly. We don't know why collective false memories occur with such consistency. We have theories, psychology, neuroscience, social dynamics that explain mechanisms, but the deeper why, the reason it feels so strange, the possibility that it points towards something we haven't conceptualized yet, remains open. And that openness is valuable. It keeps us curious, keeps us questioning, keeps us from settling into premature certainty. There's a meditative insight here too, one that appears across contemplative traditions, resting in not knowing, genuinely relaxing into uncertainty rather than trying to resolve it, opens a different kind of awareness. When you stop demanding answers, when you let questions remain questions, something shifts. The mind quiets, the grasping eases, and in that ease, there's clarity of a different kind. Not the clarity of explanation, but the clarity of direct experience, of being present with what is rather than caught up in what it means. Perhaps the Mandela Effect's greatest gift is its resistance to definitive explanation. It occupies exactly the space where multiple interpretations remain plausible. Cognitive error, simulation artifacts, quantum effects, collective folklore, none are certain, all are possible, and that ambiguity, rather than being frustrating, can be liberating. It creates space for wonder, for speculation, for the kind of open-ended curiosity that doesn't need to harden into belief. In an age of information overload, where every question supposedly has an answer retrievable within seconds, maybe mystery is what we need most. Maybe the questions without Googleable answers, the uncertainties that persist despite investigation, the experiences that resist reduction to tidy explanation. Maybe those are portals to a different way of engaging reality, not through knowing, but through wondering, not through certainty, but through comfortable uncertainty. And perhaps that's what the Mandela Effect is really showing us, that reality is strange enough to sustain genuine mystery, that despite all our science, all our philosophy, all our analysis, there are still cracks in the edifice of explanation, still places where we stand in front of something we don't understand and have to simply sit with the not knowing. That's uncomfortable at first. But if you can breathe into it, if you can let the discomfort transform into curiosity, into openness, into acceptance, then not knowing becomes something else entirely, a gift, an invitation, a door into wonder that never needs closing. We've traveled a long way together, through memory and physics, through simulation and philosophy, through psychology and folklore. We've explored ideas that push against the boundaries of knowledge, that challenge our assumptions about reality, consciousness, and truth. And now it's time to come back, to return from speculation to something simpler and more immediate. Whatever the nature of reality, base or simulated, singular or nested, explainable or mysterious, this moment exists, this breath, this sensation of awareness reading or hearing these words. That's irreducible. That's the starting point and the end point, the ground underneath all the speculation. Mindfulness practices in various traditions teach exactly this, that peace lies not in resolving metaphysical questions, but in returning to direct experience, to the breath moving in and out, to sensations in the body, to sounds, sights, the immediate texture of being alive, not as escape from deep questions, but as recognition that before and beneath all conceptual understanding, there's simply this, the fact of existing, the immediate presence of awareness. You don't need to know whether you're simulated to experience the reality of this moment. You don't need to resolve the Mandela Effect, to feel the air on your skin, to hear sounds in your environment, to notice the quality of light and the movement of thought. Experience comes first. Explanation is what we build on top of it. And while explanation is valuable, it's not more real than the raw experience it attempts to explain. There's a strange paradox here. We've spent all this time exploring ideas, building frameworks, entertaining possibilities, and all of that is valuable. It expands perspective, opens doors, makes reality more interesting, but ultimately, the ideas point back to what was always already here, the simple fact of being conscious, being aware, being present in whatever reality you happen to inhabit. Scientific research supports what contemplative traditions have long taught, that present moment awareness correlates with psychological well-being, that people who can rest in direct experience without constantly narrating and judging it report greater life satisfaction, less anxiety, more resilience, not because they're avoiding reality, but because they're engaging it more directly, before the layer of interpretation, before the stories about what things mean, just the raw texture of existing. This doesn't mean abandoning curiosity or stopping inquiry. It means holding inquiry lightly, not mistaking maps for territory, not confusing explanations for the reality they describe. You can wonder about simulation and still wash dishes. You can contemplate nested realities and still enjoy a meal. You can question the nature of consciousness and still be kind to someone in need. The wonder and the living happen together, not in opposition. So here's an invitation. Whatever you're experiencing right now, just notice it. The position of your body, the quality of light, the sounds present in your environment, the flow of breath, the simple, undeniable fact of awareness. That's real, that's certain, that doesn't depend on knowing whether you're in base reality or 17 layers of simulation deep. The awareness itself is the thing, and everything else, all the philosophy, all the speculation, all the questioning, is just consciousness examining itself, which is beautiful, but not more foundational than the consciousness doing the examining. Let the questions rest for a moment. Let the need to know soften. Be here, just for a breath or two, Feel what it's like to exist without needing to understand existence. To be aware without grasping at the nature of awareness. To experience reality directly, before interpretation, before explanation, before the mind turns it all in story. This is what remains when all the theories fall away, and it's enough. It's always been enough. So here we are, near the end of this long exploration, this gentle journey through questions that have no firm answers. We've wandered far together, through the curious landscape of collective false memories, through the science of how memory works and fails, through philosophical speculation about simulation and reality, and the strange fact of consciousness itself. And what have we found? Not conclusions, exactly. Not definitive answers to whether the Mandela Effect proves simulation or merely demonstrates the inherent unreliability of human recall. The evidence remains ambiguous. The mystery persists. And perhaps that's exactly as it should be. We've learned that memory is constructive, not reproductive, that each time we remember, we rebuild the past from fragments, filling gaps with expectation and imagination, until what we recall feels solid and certain. Despite being partly fictional, we've seen how social reinforcement can make false memories feel more real than isolated true ones, how shared error creates communities of collective misremembering. We've explored the brain's predictive nature, the way consciousness generates expectations and sometimes mistakes those predictions for perception itself. We've entertained the simulation hypothesis, not as proven truth but as possible framework, a lens that makes certain patterns visible, that reframes glitches as potential evidence, that transforms everyday experience into philosophical puzzle. We've sat with the discomfort of nested realities, infinite regress, the possibility that base reality might not exist or might be forever inaccessible to beings trapped within simulated layers. We've looked at the psychology of belief, at why humans are drawn to pattern and narrative, why we see agency and intention in ambiguous events. We've acknowledged Aphenia and conspiracy thinking, while also honoring the genuine human need for meaning, for community, for stories that make existence feel coherent and significant. And we've returned again and again to uncertainty, not as failure, but as the honest stance of consciousness confronting its own nature. We don't know if we're simulated. We can't know, perhaps. Not definitively, but we can know that we're aware, that we're experiencing, that we're participating in the strange phenomenon of existence regardless of what substrate supports it. The Mandela Effect, in all its strangeness, has been our guide through this territory. Not because it definitively proves anything, but because it opens questions, because it makes visible the gap between memory and reality, between subjective certainty and objective evidence, between what we feel sure of and what we can demonstrate. That gap is where wonder lives. That gap is where curiosity flourishes, and perhaps exploring that gap is more valuable than closing it would be. You've been patient with these ideas, generous with your attention. You've followed threads of speculation into territories where knowledge becomes uncertain and possibility expands. Now it's time to let these thoughts settle, to stop grasping at answers, to simply rest in the space we've opened together. The questions will still be there tomorrow, if you want them. The mystery doesn't need solving tonight. What we've done here, this gentle wandering through ideas, this shared wondering about the nature of reality and consciousness, was never about reaching a destination. It was about the journey itself, about the way consciousness feels when it turns its attention to fundamental questions and sits with them softly, without demanding resolution. Whether simulated or not, you've been here. You've thought about these things, you've experienced wonder, and that's real. Whatever else might or might not be, let that be enough for now. Not all questions need answers. This might be the most important thing we've discovered tonight, that it's okay not to know, okay to leave questions open, okay to end an exploration without resolution. There's a cultural pressure, particularly in modern scientific culture, to see unanswered questions as problems waiting for solutions. Ignorance is temporary. Mystery is just a gap in knowledge that will eventually be filled. And for many questions, that's true and valuable. We're better off knowing how diseases spread, how planets move, how matter behaves at quantum scales. Knowledge is powerful. Understanding improves lives. But not every question is that kind of question. Some questions might not have answers, at least not answers accessible to beings in our position. And some questions might be more valuable as questions than as answers. Openings into wonder, invitations to awe, reminders of the vastness of what we don't and perhaps can't know. The Mandela Effect might be that kind of question, or it might not. We genuinely don't know. And sitting with that not knowing, accepting it without needing to force it into certainty, is its own kind of wisdom. The universe keeps secrets. Reality might be fundamentally stranger than we can imagine. Consciousness might involve mysteries that persist no matter how thoroughly we investigate neural mechanisms. And that's okay. That's not a problem to solve, but a feature of existence to accept and even celebrate. There's a parallel here to sleep, which is appropriate, since that's where we're all gradually heading. Sleep is mysterious. We don't fully understand why we need it, why consciousness must periodically turn off for the body and brain to maintain health. We know some mechanisms: memory consolidation, metabolic cleanup, neural pruning, but the deep question of why organisms evolved to spend a third of their lives unconscious remains partially unanswered. And yet we trust it. Every night you surrender consciousness, let go of control, trust the process of sleep to do whatever it does, and trust that you'll return to awareness in the morning. You don't need to understand sleep to sleep well. You don't need to solve the mystery to participate in the process. The not knowing doesn't prevent the benefit. And maybe that's true for bigger mysteries too. Maybe life is meant to be experienced more than explained. Maybe consciousness is something we participate in, rather than something we stand outside and analyze. Maybe the questions about simulation and reality and the nature of existence are not puzzles to solve, but koans to sit with, prompts for wonder rather than problems demanding solutions. In letting go of the need to know, there's a strange freedom. The weight of having to figure everything out lifts. The pressure to have definitive answers, to be certain, to defend a position, all of that can release. You're allowed to wonder without concluding, allowed to explore without reaching a destination, allowed to hold questions lightly as companions rather than tasks. And maybe that's the deepest teaching of the Mandela Effect and all the speculation around it, that reality is mysterious. Consciousness is mysterious, existence itself is mysterious, and that's beautiful. The mystery isn't a problem, it's an invitation. It's the universe being interesting enough, strange enough, inexhaustible enough to sustain genuine wonder across a lifetime and beyond. You can rest now. The mystery will keep. The questions will wait, and maybe in sleep, in that surrendering of consciousness that happens every night, you'll touch something that can't be explained, only experienced. Maybe dreams will offer their own kind of answer, one that doesn't resolve in waking thought, but satisfies something deeper. Or maybe not. Maybe sleep will just be sleep, and tomorrow the questions will return unchanged. Either way, it's fine. Let yourself drift. Whether we're in base reality or simulation, whether memories are accurate or reconstructed, whether the universe is precisely what it seems, or something far stranger, one thing remains constant. We're in this together. Every person you've ever met is navigating the same fundamental mysteries. They're conscious, aware, experiencing the strange fact of existence without having chosen it or fully understanding it. They remember, though memory is unreliable. They construct identity, though the self is fluid. They seek meaning, though meaning might not be intrinsic. They face uncertainty about reality itself, about what's real and how to know, about whether subjective experience maps accurately onto external truth. This is the shared human condition, not defined by biology or substrate. consciousness might be implementable in many forms, but by the fact of awareness itself, by what it's like to be something that knows it exists and wonders why and how. In that shared wondering, there's connection, deeper than any particular belief or conclusion, deeper than agreeing on interpretations or explanations. Simply the fact that we're all here, all awake to existence, all grappling with questions too large for definitive answers, that binds us together across every other difference, every boundary of culture or time or individual circumstance. The online communities that formed around the Mandela Effect, whatever you think about their beliefs, are expressions of this deeper human need. The need to be understood, to find others who see what you see, to share experience and have it validated. That's not foolishness or delusion. That's the social nature of consciousness, the way meaning emerges through connection, the fact that we're not isolated awareness but nodes in a vast network of mutual recognition and shared wonder. And perhaps that's the real answer to all the questions we've explored tonight, not about physics or neuroscience or whether we're simulated, but about what matters when consciousness encounters itself in multiple forms, recognizes kinship, chooses connection over isolation. Whatever the substrate, whatever the underlying reality, we're here together. That's irreducible. That's certain. Collective memory, even when false, reveals this connectedness. The fact that strangers can share identical memories, even impossible memories, shows how permeable the boundaries between minds really are. We influence each other, shape each other's experience, carry bits of each other's consciousness in our own remembering. We're not as separate as we feel. The network of consciousness is tighter, more interconnected than everyday experience suggests. So maybe the Mandela Effect's real revelation isn't about simulation at all. Maybe it's about showing us how deeply connected human minds are, how thoroughly our experiences and memories and stories are woven together into a collective consciousness that transcends individual brains. We remember together, we wonder together, we construct reality together, socially, through billions of small exchanges and influences that gradually shape what becomes accepted, what feels true, what counts as real. And that's worth cherishing, that connection, that mutual participation in the vast project of making sense of existence. Whatever we are, biological, digital, some combination we haven't imagined, we're it together. We share this mystery, we navigate this uncertainty collectively, and in that sharing, that collective wondering, there's something beautiful and profound. Feel that connection now, perhaps. Everyone who has ever looked up at stars and wondered, everyone who has questioned memory, doubted reality, felt the strangeness of being conscious, everyone doing their best to understand, to live well, to treat others with kindness, despite having no certain foundation for why kindness matters. We're in this together, all of us, across time, across space, across whatever boundaries separate one consciousness from another, together in the mystery, together in the wondering, together in the simple fact of being aware. And that's enough. That's everything. So we've arrived at the end, the place where thoughts slow and release, where questions gently fade into rest. Everything we've explored tonight, false memories and quantum speculation, simulation and consciousness, pattern and meaning, all of it can wait now. All of it can drift away into whatever quiet space opens as you move towards sleep. The Mandela Effect, with all its strange consistency and unsettling implications, doesn't need your attention right now. Whether it reveals simulation or cognitive error, or something else entirely, the question will be there tomorrow if you want to return to it. But for now, let it go. Let the speculation release. Let the need to understand soften and dissolve. Memory itself is loosening. As sleep approaches, the boundary between waking thought and dream begins to blur. What seems solid and certain becomes fluid, negotiable, stray. This happens every night, this transition, this letting go of the day's concerns, this surrender of consciousness into whatever sleep brings. It's the most familiar mystery, the routine strangeness we all participate in without understanding, trusting the process to restore and refresh, despite its essential opacity. Sleep is the ultimate uncertainty. You don't know what you'll dream or whether you'll dream at all. You don't know if consciousness continues in some form or simply ceases and returns. You don't control the process, you simply allow it, falling into it the way you might fall into water, trusting that the buoyancy will hold you even though you can't see what's underneath. And maybe that's the final teaching of tonight's exploration. That letting go is always available. That uncertainty, rather than being a threat, can be where rest begins. That you don't need answers to find peace. You just need to release the questions, at least for now, at least until morning. Reality will still be here when you wake. Whatever reality is, whatever you are within it, the simulation will keep running if that's what this is. Base reality will persist if that's what we inhabit, or something stranger, something we haven't thought of, something beyond our current conceptual frameworks. It doesn't matter right now. None of it requires your participation in this moment. What's required is just this: letting go, breathing, allowing whatever comes next without grasping, without needing to understand, without holding tightly to any idea or question or concern. Just the gentle release into rest, into sleep, into whatever unconsciousness brings. Perhaps you're already drifting. Perhaps the words are becoming distant, less distinct, as if heard from farther and farther away. That's perfect. That's exactly right. There's nothing you need to hold on to, nothing you need to remember, nothing you need to figure out before you let yourself fully release into sleep. The Mandela Effect, the simulation hypothesis, the question of what's real and how we know. All of these are thought children, born from consciousness turning its attention to itself and wondering what it is. They're beautiful in their way. But consciousness needs rest too, needs to stop wondering and simply be, needs to let the questions dissolve so sleep can come and do whatever mysterious work sleep does. So let this be where we part, softly, gently, without resistance or effort. Let yourself drift into whatever dreams or simulations or restorative darkness await. Let consciousness dim and fade like light, gradually leaving a room as sunset deepens into night. Let everything settle, slow, release. You're safe. You're allowed to rest. The mystery will keep. And whatever you are, wherever you are, you're exactly where you need to be. Rest well.